Hi, my name is Lindsay, and I am going to talk about my grief story. I'm just going to go through the prompts that we were given. So, in terms of my belief about loss, um, I think it's really complicated. So, right now, I work in the field of developmental disabilities, and there is a saying that goes around that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And I really think that the same is true when it comes to loss. I think that people experience them differently, people deal with their emotions differently, and then we are dealing with all different kinds of loss. So, it could be things from you know, going through the death of a loved one, facing death yourself. It could be losing a pet, losing a car, a house fire. It could be change in your job, a change in where you're living. Maybe you moved out of state. And I think all of those things are loss, but they're all different kinds of loss. And there are different levels of complication and seriousness when it comes to those things. So one of my biggest beliefs about loss is that it doesn't really fit into a mold. It's different for everybody. And even, within one person, I think that one type of loss for myself is different than, if I was to go through a different loss of something else. So, losing my grandmother a couple of years ago is a completely different loss and grieving process than going through my divorce right now. So, I think that it's very dependent on the person, on what kind of loss you're going through, and where you are. There are times when we have loss after loss at the same time frame in our life, but a lot of times it's a loss, and then we have a little bit of time to grow and learn from that loss, and then we move on to the next one. So I think the loss changes for us with every time that we go through it. It's inevitable, but it's different every time. Another thing that I really believe is that it's not linear. So I tend to subscribe to the stage model of things. I think that it just works really well with the way my mind is organized. And it's really been explanatory for the loss that I've experienced in my life. Um, so I think when it comes to that, thinking about it from the stage model, it's important to me that we recognize the fact that it's not necessarily linear. So there are those stages of grief that you're expected to go through, and I think that naively we think that we go through them step one, step two, step three, but really that's not the case. And another thing that's really important to pay attention to is the fact that we go through them many times. I know just thinking about the divorce that I'm going through, or that I just went through, that was a huge loss for me, and I didn't go through the grief process and those grief steps just one time. I went through them once, then I went through them again, and it was deeper. It was deeper each time. I think that loss happens on many levels. We experience it on all different levels, and so we might heal on the very surface level the first way through the steps, and then the second way through, we're kind of dealing with things in a more deep level. So I think it's important just to be really flexible with the loss process itself. In terms of my spiritual beliefs about death, I struggle with this question because I am a questioner and I tend to be like a cherry picker of different religions. I grew up in a very, very conservative um, church going family, and while I still subscribe to some of the things that I learned there, I also believe in a lot of different things. I think that the one thing I concretely know is that um, I don't believe that death is just an end place. I think that there is an afterlife. What that looks like, I don't know. I don't know if we go someplace, if we're just kind of hanging around here. I don't know what happens. I will have to be honest with that. That's something that I have spent a lot of time trying to study and understand and kind of search my own soul for. And I do not have a concrete answer as to what life after death is. But I do tend to be of the belief system that people do have ways of communicating with us through, symbols and, all those kind of spiritual things without making me seem like a weirdo. I do tend to have those beliefs. I'm a very spiritual person and I'm very in tune and sensitive to those sort of things. So I do think that there is something to the fact that I don't think that anybody ever really leaves us altogether. I think that there are ways um, to continue that healing afterwards. So I think that's kind of a non-answer to that question because I really don't know. I wish I did. It would make um, my sleeping a little bit easier if I did know what I believed when it comes to that kind of stuff. But I am just in a place of um, really exploring my beliefs just in general, and that also includes my beliefs when it comes to death. So there's that. In terms of my letter of forgiveness, I did write my letter of forgiveness, and I wrote it um, in regards to my divorce. And I was kind of surprised that this is not something that I had done before. I do a lot of writing. I started a blog when I first started the whole divorce process. It's very raw and very emotional, and I write there um, pretty regularly. It's a really therapeutic thing for me to do. I only share it with certain people. I'm open to sharing it with just about anybody, but it's not something, it's so heavy emotionally, and it's such a picture of my healing process that I don't just expect anybody to read it. So um, if anybody would want to read it, that's go for it. But that's sort of a better picture for me of my whole grieving process. And it really kind of shows those steps that I went through. So saying all that, I was kind of surprised to think about the fact that I never really had written a letter of forgiveness. It's not something that I had really heard of or thought about. So this is really interesting. And I will say that I wrote a letter of forgiveness, and I don't think that I'm done writing my letter of forgiveness. I wrote it out, but I think that it's something that I would like to go through again, and I would like to add more detail in. I will also say that I don't feel comfortable reading it because as I shared in a lot of the posts in this class, I got my divorce because I was in an abusive relationship. And in my letter of forgiveness, I was very specific about the things that I was forgiving my husband for. And a lot of the incidences of abuse, and I was very specific about them, I have not even shared with my family. My mom doesn't know, and I've never really spoken out loud some of the things that happened to me. So I will have to respectfully say that I don't believe I can share my letter of forgiveness. I think that it was very powerful. And it wasn't as hurtful as I thought it might be going through those situations and actually kind of going through my 6-year relationship and picking out as many of those abuse scenarios that I could think of and kind of reliving them as I wrote them down. I really expected it to be very like heart-wrenching for me, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It was actually more empowering than anything. I felt like it allowed me to um, process them differently and to kind of check off the list of, yeah, that's out of my life and I don't have to live with that anymore. I don't think I'll ever fully just give those things up. I think that there's a difference between forgiveness and forgetting. And forgetting is not something that's going to happen very easily. Um, but I do think that I have forgiven those situations, and it was definitely helpful for me to actually speak out all of those things because those situations, just visualizing the things that happened to me are things that, when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you can't sleep, that's what's playing over in your mind. And you wake up feeling all of those emotions. And it's scary and it's very difficult to handle. So I think being able to actually get them out on paper and to write them, which writing is where I feel like I am at my most powerful is when I'm writing. Um, it was a good thing to do. I apologize for not being able to share it, but I just have to kind of protect a little bit of the sanctity of my own story. So something that I won't share, but I did find it to be a very beneficial thing, and I absolutely can see myself doing it again. And more importantly, I could see myself recommending that to my clients as a counselor. We were asked about our preferred type of grief, and I kind of took this, I interpreted this to be the intuitive versus instrumental kind of grief. I'm definitely an intuitive person when it comes to anything, but definitely the grief process. I kind of allow myself just to feel what I feel, and I deal with it when I come up to it. I think the only time that I've ever done something instrumental was with my writing, but I don't necessarily think that I sat down and said, I'm going to heal myself, so I'm going to write. It was more of a situation where I love to write and it just happened. It was more of an intuitive type of thing. So I really would rather feel the emotions and process the emotions and kind of, I guess, map out where that hurt is and then try and figure out how I can move past it and process it. But a lot of what I do is just talking things out and, praying things out and meditating things out with myself a lot of the time. So I'm very much an intuitive person. I'm not the person that needs to, plant a garden or paint a room or things like that. Intuitiveness is absolutely the way that I prefer to grieve. That doesn't mean that I'm not open to other types of grief. I just know that for me, that's really my go-to. 5 blockers to my grief. I am great at blocking out emotions. I tend to numb a lot of things. So I kind of can categorize them into two different categories. So I do a lot of excessive behaviors and I do a lot of neglectful behaviors. So for people that have been in class with me before, I've shared that I do have a diagnosis of binge eating disorder, and it comes from a lot of traumatic things that happened in my childhood. I know that was the trigger, and whenever I get into a situation where things are scary or they hurt, my tendency is to try and hurt myself more than those experiences because that's something that I can control. So that is my absolute first go-to excessive behavior in my divorce process. I gained about 20 pounds because I was in that process of binging and never purging, and it was really, really bad. So that's my go-to behavior when it comes to grief or any kind of emotions. So that excessive behavior is huge for me. Another thing I do is working, so I really throw myself into my job. I, over the last few months, have probably worked 14-hour days, most days a week. I took on a little side business. I made myself so very busy that I couldn't think about what was going on inside. And it kind of puts me in a place where I will eventually just kind of crash at the end. So that's definitely a big thing that I do. Another thing that I do, excessive behaviors wise, would be caring for others before myself. So, like I said, I left my marriage because it was abusive. I had a really hard time with my stepdaughter. That was there's a lot of animosity there and a lot of pain, and she was physically abusive as well. And in those situations, when I asked for the divorce, the only people that I cared about was them and making sure that they were okay and making sure that my family wasn't going to miss them too much. And it really took me a long time to think about my own process. So all of my care and my love and my worry went to everybody except myself. So that's pretty typical of me as well. In terms of neglectful behaviors, I really have high expectations for myself. I'm very much a perfectionist and I'm very hard on myself. So when it comes to the grief process, I expect myself to be healed immediately. I expect myself to be stronger than anybody else. I expect to be able to process emotions quicker. And, I had read going through divorce that you go through the process a couple of times, and I was bound and determined to just go through it one time and like ace the game, and I did not. So that really, I think that maybe I could have gone through the grieving process a little faster than I did if I had allowed myself the flexibility that I needed and that I would allow anybody else. I just tend to treat myself not so fairly. I also tend to not reach out for help, and I think I actually mentioned it earlier that I tend to go through loss and grief and any emotion by myself very intuitively trying to figure it out. So it's very difficult for me to reach out to other people and let them know that I'm not perfect and that I'm actually having emotions and that I need some help. So I would think that there are lots of blockers and unhealthy things that I do when it comes to grief and loss, but those would probably be the 5 biggest. In terms of 5 healthy interventions that I take place in, I think writing, of course, is the biggest one. I love writing. I'm not confident in a lot of things. I think that most people know that by now. But one thing I am very confident in is my writing. So that's sort of a safe place where I don't have to worry about what other people are thinking. And it's been really, really helpful. Had I not started my blog when I was going through my divorce, I don't know how far in the grieving process I would be, but it's really, really helped me to sort of process the emotions that I'm going through and then sit down and put them on paper, and then I can go back and look at them. That's something that I actually did as I was writing my letter of forgiveness, was I went back to the beginning of my blog back in October when this whole process started, and I was able to read through it. And I can now read through it without crying through every post, which tells me that I am reaching a place where I'm starting to heal. Another healthy intervention for me is therapy. I love therapy. I love the therapy process. I love my therapist. And thankfully, I had started going to my therapist about 3 years ago. So we had done all the prep work that we needed to do for me to be successful in this. And I really think that the fact that I started going to therapy and that I did a lot of work to become stronger was 100% of the reason for me to be able to actually put my foot down and leave a situation that I needed to leave. Just talking about it in general is big for me. I talk about it with the people around me. It's good for me to just kind of sit down with my mom or a coworker or a friend, or even just in front of the camera and talk about those things and just get it out of my head. I have a very overactive thought process and I'm thinking about 50 million things at once. So if I'm able to get those thoughts together in a nice compact package and pass them out of my mind, that's really helpful for me. As simple as it is just to talk about it, I really, really enjoy that. Music is another really big one for me. I communicate a lot through music. I'm very quiet, have a lot of social anxiety, so a lot of times I find that I identify with a song and it really talks about the emotions that I'm having, and I'm able to kind of cry myself through that song, repeated it over and over and over, and that's really helpful. And there are songs for different ear types or different losses that I've had, and different emotions that I felt, and even through the grieving process, I have a song that really kind of powered me through the beginning of my divorce, and then one that really powered me through kind of the difficult toe-to-toe court process, and then the actual just kind of the loss of it all. I have other songs that help me through that. So music is a big thing that helps me through my loss and grieving process. Another thing that really helps me is mindfulness, and I think of mindfulness in terms of meditating and that very formal mindful practice. But I think when it comes to loss for me, it's the ability to just notice the emotions and not try to numb the emotions, but just notice them. And that was the biggest thing that I was able to do. I went from numbing them and trying to, fill all my voids and hurt myself in other ways to just being mindful. And it was a months-long process. The whole process was about 6 months, and I think that only a couple months ago did I stop being in the place where I would just say, I'm feeling sad. And just being able to name it was huge for me. So it took a lot of very pointed focus on being mindful of things. And the practice of mindfulness means that you're not, like if you're doing mindfulness meditation, you're not having your thoughts and kind of chastising yourself for having those thoughts and trying to get them to go away. You're just kind of noticing them and acknowledging them and then going on about your life. And that was really, really helpful for me because I was able to identify different emotions and eventually was able to identify things that I needed to do to help those emotions feel better or to go away or to grow. So just being able to kind of sit down mindfully, and even throughout the day when I wasn't, specifically thinking about grief, I would start to get a little bit of a feeling and I would say, oh, I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling really sad, or just playing things out that way was really, really helpful. So I think mindfulness is a huge, huge tool for me in terms of grief. And then finally, I think that my definition of anamnesis, I hope I said that right. It's terribly hard word to say. But I think that for me, it's finding a place where you are at peace. I have for months now been really focused on trying to find peace, and I really think that that is kind of that anamnesis and kind of craving for that to happen. But I think that it's kind of finding a place of peace between the loss itself and the new reality. So everything kind of comes together in one place, and things are just really peaceful and calm, and you're just okay. You know that you're okay. And I think it's really part of just appreciating the past and knowing that it formed you in the way that it formed you, and that you are who you are because of your experiences in the past. But at the same time, you're not stuck living in it. And I mean, I could take an example from, my marriage and think that I can think about situations where I was really, really trying hard to, help my husband to be okay enough where he would stop doing things to hurt me. And I, learned a lot about myself to try and fix the situation. And there are a lot of hurtful situations that came through it. And in the process of going through the hurts that I did and making a pointed effort to try and better myself to hopefully fix things, it didn't work. Obviously, you can't fix somebody that's like that. There's no fixing it. It wasn't my fault in the first place. But I would not have gone through the growth process that I did had I not gone through my marriage. So I can kind of look at these abuse situations, the things that I wrote about, and I can say, you know what, it happened. I wish it didn't happen, but at the same time, I would not be who I am if it didn't happen that way, and then put it away and not think about it all the time, not keep myself up at night worrying about it and reliving the pain of it. I just know that I am the strong woman that I am because of the loss that I've experienced, but that I can take that strength right now and then move forward in my life.